The Galactic Empire had grown arrogant in its victories. Across the stars, believing that no force could stand against its endless fleets and armored legions. On the edge of a forgotten world scarred by fire and smoke, the Empire fought a brutal campaign to crush the last sparks of resistance. When the battle ended, two figures remained standing in the wreckage, surrounded by broken machines and fallen warriors. They fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, and yet they were overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers that the Empire hurled against them. The soldiers swarmed them with chains and iron grips, dragging them down into the dirt and binding their hands as if they were savage beasts to be caged. Even as the Empire soldiers mocked and jeered, the prisoners stared back with cold, unflinching eyes that unsettled the hardest veterans. There was something in those eyes, a darkness that whispered of stories told in frightened voices by firelight, stories of hunters and shadows that stalked across galaxies. The commanders of the Empire ignored the unease of their soldiers. They saw only two men captured and broken. Trophies of their campaign to the Empire. They were nothing more than prisoners of war, faceless enemies to be paraded and discarded. The prisoners were dragged through mud that smelled of blood and burned metal across a battlefield, littered with the ruin of cities and the bones of the dead. Every step was heavy, yet defiant, as if they refused to kneel. Even in chains, the Empire soldiers shoved them to their knees at the edge of the ruined square and forced them to bow before the banners of conquest that hung like curses from shattered towers. The prisoners did not bow willingly. Their bodies were pressed down by brute strength, but their spirits stood tall, like unbroken blades in a storm. Around them the soldiers laughed and spit. They cursed and kicked at the men who refused to show fear. The commanders watched in silence, their faces hidden behind cold masks of authority, their hearts deaf to mercy or honor. In their minds there could be no risk of escape, no risk of rebellion. These prisoners had to die quickly, and without ceremony. So the order was given with a voice that carried no feeling, only the weight of duty. Execute them tonight in the shadows, so their deaths will be unseen, and their memory forgotten. The soldiers obeyed, as they always did, without question, without pause for thought. The prisoners were dragged away from the ruins and taken to the outskirts where the stars burned faint through a blackened sky. There they were thrown to the ground like broken animals, their chains clattering like iron songs of despair. But even as they fell, their eyes never dimmed. The soldiers felt that gaze upon them like knives in the dark, yet they pressed on, tightening their grips on their weapons. None of them knew that history itself was watching that night. None of them understood that they stood at the edge of awakening, something far older and far more terrible than the Empire itself. The order of execution was passed down the chain of command as though it were nothing more than another routine directive in the endless machinery of war. The commanders spoke with voices like stone, devoid of compassion or hesitation, and their words echoed in the silence of the ruined world. Take them beyond the walls, take them where no eyes will see, and end their lives before the sun rises. The soldiers bowed their heads, not in respect but in obedience, for within the Empire obedience was law and hesitation was death. They gathered in the dim hours of night, their armor gleaming faint beneath the pale glow of distant moons, and their weapons held tight in nervous hands. The prisoners were dragged from the holding cells with chains that clattered against the cracked stone floors, each step heavy with exhaustion, yet unbroken in spirit. The guards cursed them, spat at them, shoved them forward, but no sound escaped the lips of the prisoners. They walked with silence that felt heavier than steel, silence that spoke louder than words, silence that made even the guards shiver, though they dared not show it. As they crossed the ruined streets of the once proud city, the shadows of broken towers loomed like jagged teeth against the sky. Fires still smoldered in the distance, their smoke drifting through the air, like the last breath of a dying world. The prisoners were led down a road littered with shattered machines and scorched banners, symbols of a rebellion that had been crushed under the Empire heel. Yet within the ashes of that defeat, the two men walked with dignity, as if the chains that bound them were nothing more than threads to be torn at will. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones as they marched. Some laughed to hide their unease, others muttered of curses and omens, for they felt something unnatural in the air. The commanders dismissed such talk, for to them fear was weakness, and weakness was punished with fire. At last they reached the outskirts of the city, where the land was nothing but barren soil and jagged stone, where no witnesses would dare to come. The soldiers formed a circle, their boots crunching against the earth as they raised their rifles. In preparation, the moonlight fell upon the prisoners casting their faces in cold silver glow, and in that light their eyes gleamed with a fury that unsettled even the boldest warrior. One soldier whispered that it felt as though death itself stood before them wearing human skin. Another silenced him quickly for fear that the commanders might hear such weakness. The order was given with a single sharp word that cut through the air like a blade. The soldiers raised their rifles, aimed with steady arms, and pulled the triggers as fire and thunder roared in the night. The prisoners fell without a cry, their bodies collapsing into the dirt. As the smoke drifted away, the soldiers lowered their weapons with relief. Believing their duty done, they left the bodies where they lay, turning back toward the city, their minds eager to forget the faces of the men they had slain. But the earth itself seemed to tremble in quiet defiance, as if it too knew that the night was far from finished. The soldiers returned to the city with the calm of men who believed their work was finished, and their victory secured. They boasted of their efficiency and their loyalty to the Empire, laughing as if they had done nothing more than clear debris from the streets of a conquered world. The commanders listened in silence, their eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for threats that no longer existed. They marked the names of the fallen prisoners in records as mere numbers, faceless and forgotten, erased from history with the stroke of a stylus within the barracks. The soldiers ate and drank, telling each other stories of battles won and enemies crushed, never once thinking of the two bodies left behind in the dust. The fire in the center of the ruined city burned bright as if mocking the quiet celebration, its smoke curling upward to vanish into the cold night sky. The Empire banners hung torn and tattered from the ruins of towers, symbols of power stretched thin across a galaxy, unwilling to bow, but crushed by overwhelming force. The prisoners, however, still lay where they had fallen, there, chains twisted around their limbs, their blood soaking into the barren earth. The moon drifted across the heavens, casting long shadows over the bodies, and the wind carried whispers that no human tongue could claim. The land itself seemed restless, as if aware that the night carried more than silence, more than death, for death had touched these men, but death had not claimed them. Their hearts slowed but did not stop, their eyes closed but did not darken, their spirits sank into the deep void, and there, in that void, something ancient stirred. The stories told across campfires and battlefields were not mere fables, they were warnings. The Baba Yaga, the shadow who moved through wars like a phantom, was more than myth. He was flesh, blood, and vengeance, bound into human form. The American Boogeyman, the man whose enemies feared the sound of footsteps in the dark, was not a tale to frighten children. He was the last terror a soldier would ever see. The Empire believed they had buried these legends under chains and bullets, but legends cannot be buried. They awakened. The air around the bodies grew heavy, as if the world itself held its breath. The earth was soaked with blood, yet it pulsed with energy unseen, the kind of energy that comes when fear collides with fury. The chains around the prisoners began to rattle, though no hand touched them, and the soil beneath them cracked, as though rejecting the weight of their supposed deaths. A crow landed upon a broken stone near the bodies, its black eyes gleaming in the pale moonlight. It watched silently, and then took flight, as if startled by what it sensed. In the distance, the Empire soldiers laughed within their barracks, yet those closest to the outskirts felt unease creep into their bones. Dogs howled at shadows, cats hissed at the wind, and children dreamed of figures rising from the ground. Night grew colder, though no storm approached, and the stars seemed to dim, as if afraid to witness what was about to unfold. The Empire thought their task was done, yet in truth their nightmare had only begun. The bodies of the two prisoners lay still in the dust, their limbs bound by heavy chains, their faces turned toward the dark sky, as if waiting for judgment from the stars. The Empire soldiers believed they were nothing more than corpses left to rot in forgotten soil, but the night itself knew otherwise. For these were not ordinary men, and the universe whispered their names in fear and awe. Long before the Empire had risen, the first was called the Baba Yaga, a title spoken in voices so low that even the bravest warriors trembled at the sound. He was a phantom who walked through wars without leaving a trace, save for the trail of silence left in his wake. Legends claimed he was more shadow than man, a hunter who stalked his prey without rest, a spirit of vengeance wrapped in human flesh. The second was known as the American Boogeyman, a figure feared in every conflict where soldiers vanished without explanation. He was said to be a master of war who turned battlefields into graveyards, a man who fought with the patience of death itself and the rage of storms. Together they were myths to some, and nightmares to others, yet here they lay bound and broken, their blood soaking into the earth. But myths do not die easily, and nightmares do not fade when the sun rises. The air thickened around them, the wind stilled, as though nature itself bowed before what was awakening. The Baba Yaga stirred first, his chest rising with a breath so deep it echoed like thunder in the silence of the night. His fingers twitched against the cold chains and his eyes opened to reveal a glare that could pierce through stone beside him. The American Boogeyman moved his body, trembling with a force that was not weakness but fury. His jaw clenched, and his gaze burned with fire, as if he were staring at enemies unseen, yet already doomed. The soil beneath them cracked with each breath, as though the world rejected their burial and demanded their return. Crows circled overhead, their cries echoing like omens carried on the wind, and every living creature within the forest and field grew restless, sensing predators rising. The Baba Yaga slowly pushed himself from the ground, his chains grinding against stone, yet breaking with each movement, as though they were nothing more than threads of cloth. The boogeyman followed with a roar that never left his throat, his silence more terrifying than any battle cry. Together they rose from the earth like specters called forth from forgotten tales, their shadows stretching long beneath the pale moonlight. Their faces bore no fear, no hesitation, only the promise of vengeance carved deep into every scar and every breath. The night shuddered around them, as if the stars themselves understood that legends had taken form once more. The Empire had not killed two prisoners of war. The Empire had awakened the Baba Yaga and the American Boogeyman. The first whispers of fear began with the night patrol that wandered too close to the outskirts of the ruined city, where the Baftis had been left behind. 6 soldiers marched in formation, their rifles ready, their armor glinting faintly in the pale moonlight, and yet their voices carried unease. They spoke of shadows moving between the broken walls. They spoke of chains rattling in the wind. They spoke of curses from the dead. Their commander silenced them with harsh words, reminding them that the Empire feared nothing, and that weakness was death. But even his own steps faltered when the silence grew too heavy. The patrol passed near the barren field where the 2 prisoners had been executed, and for a moment they thought they saw figures standing in the distance. The commander ordered them forward, yet the closer they came, the more the figures dissolved into darkness, as though the night itself swallowed them whole. Then the first soldier vanished, his place in the line empty, as if he had never been there at all. The others called his name, their voices shaking, but no answer came, only the sound of chains grinding softly against stone. The second soldier screamed as a shadow cut across his throat, swift and merciless, his body crumpling to the ground before the others even raised their weapons. The Baba Yaga moved like smoke, drifting between them, unseen, until the moment of death, his hands striking with precision, his blades slicing through armor as if it were paper. Panic shattered the formation. The soldiers fired blindly into the night, their rifles flashing in every direction but hitting nothing. Then the American Boogeyman appeared behind them, his eyes burning with fury, his movements brutal and unstoppable. He tore the rifle from one soldier and turned it against him with ruthless precision, the blast tearing through chest and armor before the man even drew breath. Another tried to flee, but the Boogeyman's hand caught his throat, lifting him into the air and crushing the life from him with terrifying calm. The last survivor dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, begging the shadows for mercy. The Baba Yaga stood over him, his silence colder than words, his presence heavier than the weight of 1,000 armies. The prisoner begged until his voice broke, but mercy was not something the Baba Yaga carried in his soul. The blade fell, swift and final, leaving the ground soaked in blood as the whispers of fear carried on the wind. By dawn, the patrol was gone, their bodies scattered in silence, their blood marking the soil like a warning carved into the earth itself. When the next patrol arrived, they found only emptiness, broken armor, and the mark of chains etched into stone, as though the night itself had left a signature. The whispers spread quickly through the garrison, soldiers speaking of ghosts rising from death, of shadows walking again, of demons wearing human faces. The Empire tried to crush the rumors with threats and punishment, yet even the bravest warriors looked to the night with unease. The Baba Yaga and the American Boogeyman had begun their hunt, and the galaxy would soon remember their names. The disappearance of the first patrol unsettled the garrison, but the Empire commanders dismissed it as failure of discipline or desertion, and they ordered more soldiers into the ruins to restore order. Another patrol marched into the night, their steps firm, their rifles charged, their orders clear, but by dawn they too did not return. All that was found of them were scattered helmets, broken rifles, and stains of blood upon the earth. No bodies, no witnesses, only silence heavier than stone. Fear spread like fire among the ranks, for soldiers whispered that the two prisoners had risen from death and walked once more. Among the living, the commanders called it nonsense and punished any man who spoke of ghosts, but punishment could not silence the dread in their hearts. The next evening the Empire sent an entire squadron of armored troops, equipped with heavy weapons, to sweep the outskirts and burn any trace of resistance. The squadron moved in perfect formation, their machines rumbling through the shattered streets, their voices steady with forced courage. Yet the deeper they marched, the more the shadows seemed to tighten around them, as if the city itself rejected their presence. The first explosion came without warning. A vehicle erupted in flame, tearing soldiers apart before they could react. The Baba Yaga emerged from the smoke, his eyes cold, his blade flashing with inhuman precision. He moved faster than sight, slipping between the squadrons, striking from behind before they even raised their weapons. Men screamed as their throats opened, as their armor split, as silence claimed them one by one. Then came the American Boogeyman, his rifle roaring in the darkness, his shots never missing, his every step crushing fear into the hearts of those who dared to stand. He fought with brutal efficiency, each movement designed to kill, each strike leaving only ruin in his path. A soldier raised a heavy cannon, but the Boogeyman ripped it from his grasp and turned it on him, blasting him into ash without a sound. The squadron broke apart, soldiers fleeing in every direction, yet none escaped the hunt. Some vanished into alleys where shadows closed in and chains rattled until silence returned. Others tried to climb the ruins but fell screaming as unseen hands pulled them back into the dark. By the time the moon reached its peak, the entire squadron was gone. Only wreckage and blood remained. The survivors within the city walls heard the distant echoes of battle, but none dared to investigate. When morning came, the commanders ordered another search, but the soldiers refused. Their eyes hollow with terror, their bodies trembling with memories of the whispers. Discipline began to fracture, loyalty began to fade, and even the most hardened warriors muttered that the Empire had awakened something it could not control. The Baba Yaga and the American Boogeyman were no longer prisoners, they were predators set loose upon the Empire, and nothing could stop their hunt. The garrison walls trembled not from artillery or bombardment, but from the weight of fear pressing upon every soldier within. Men who once shouted orders with iron voices now whispered to one another, their eyes darting to shadows that seemed to move on their own. The commanders barked orders, demanding patrols, demanding discipline, demanding loyalty, but their words fell hollow against the silence that crept through the ranks. For each night, soldiers vanished without a trace, rifles left behind, helmets cracked open, armor empty and cold. The Baba Yaga had become a phantom, slipping into barracks, moving with steps so silent that even trained ears heard nothing. Until the blade fell, he struck with precision, each cut clean, each movement measured, leaving no wasted motion, and no sound save the soft rattle of chains that haunted the survivors'. Stories spread among the soldiers that he appeared behind men before they even knew he was near, that his shadow stretched across walls long before his body arrived. Fear tightened throats, fear made hands tremble, fear made soldiers aim their rifles at empty doorways, praying shadows would not take form. At the same time, the American Boogeyman struck like a storm that no wall could hold. He moved with brutal strength and unrelenting fury, breaking doors with his shoulders, tearing weapons from hands, and shattering resistance with each strike. His bullets found their marks with uncanny accuracy, his blows broke bones and morale alike, and wherever he walked, silence followed. The soldiers began to see him in every dark corner, in every flicker of torchlight, in every creak of metal. Some swore they saw his eyes glowing in the blackness, watching, waiting, counting down their last breaths. Entire squads deserted their posts, fleeing into the wilds, rather than face the terror inside the walls. But the Empire punished them, mercilessly calling them cowards. Yet punishment could not erase the truth that the garrison was falling apart, not from outside attack, but from the nightmare within. One commander tried to rally his men, gathering them in the courtyard. Beneath the tattered banners of the Empire, he shouted of glory, of duty, of unshakable strength, but his words froze as a figure appeared behind him, silent and certain. The Baba Yaga stood with eyes like knives, and before the commander could even turn, the blade cut clean and swift, leaving the body crumpled at the foot of the banner. The soldiers screamed in chaos, firing wildly yet hitting nothing, and when the smoke cleared, the phantom was gone, leaving only the corpse of their leader. As a warning, that same night the Boogeyman tore through the supply lines, destroying food, water, and ammunition. With ruthless efficiency he left, no survivors, only wreckage and whispers, and the soldiers knew then that this was not war, it was extermination. The garrison walls stood tall, the banner still waved, but inside no soldier truly believed in victory anymore. They knew that every shadow carried death, and every sound of chains or footsteps marked the arrival of nightmares that could not be killed. The Empire garrison that once held thousands of disciplined soldiers now trembled like a cornered animal waiting for the strike it could not escape. Every corridor carried echoes of footsteps, every room seemed heavy with unseen eyes, every corner of shadow felt alive with hunger. The Baba Yaga moved among them with impossible grace, his form shifting between light and darkness, as if the night itself obeyed his will. He struck without warning, slipping into watchtowers and leaving them silent. Before the alarms could sound, a guard would blink and find his partner gone, replaced only by the faint trace of blood glistening. On stone, the soldiers tried to form defenses, placing barricades along the halls, setting mines along the roads, but each trap failed, for the Baba Yaga saw every weakness and exploited it with calm precision where he walked. Death followed, not with noise, not with fire, but with silence, so deep it suffocated the living. In another quarter of the garrison, the American Boogeyman brought war with thunder in his hands and fury in his heart. He tore through fortified positions with strength that shattered steel and resolve that broke the will of even the boldest warriors. His rifle never missed his fists, never faltered. His presence alone drained courage from the men who dared to face him. He turned the Empire weapons against them, their own cannons blasting through their defenses, their own explosives igniting in their stores. Every scream echoed like a hymn of fear, every explosion like the tolling of a funeral bell for an army that had already lost. The commanders attempted to rally reinforcements, broadcasting orders across the channels of war, but their voices cracked with fear and no soldier obeyed. Deserters fled into the night, yet the night itself belonged to the Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman, and soon even the deserters vanished. The Empire tried to send in machines of war, towering walkers with blazing cannons, yet even these fell. The Baba Yaga climbed their shadows, cutting wires and veins of steel, until they collapsed like dying beasts. The Boogeyman faced them head-on with grenades and gunfire, tearing through armor, until fire consumed their frames. By the third night of terror, the garrison no longer resembled a stronghold, it was a tomb waiting to be sealed. Fires burned unchecked, supplies were destroyed, bodies lay uncollected, and soldiers huddled together, whispering prayers to gods that had long abandoned them. Some swore they heard chains rattling in the wind, others claimed to see a figure standing at the edge of their vision, watching with eyes that glowed like coals. The Baba Yaga left symbols carved into stone, marks of warning that spoke without words, reminding the Empire that death itself had chosen a side. The American Boogeyman left ruins of machinery scattered across the fields, monuments of vengeance, for all to see. Together they became more than men, more than myths, they became inevitability. The garrison fell, not with a battle but with silence, for there was no empire left inside its walls, only corpses, ashes, and the lingering dread of legends reborn. The fall of the garrison was not hidden, though the Empire tried to bury the truth beneath layers of silence and propaganda. Words spread through deserters, smugglers, and frightened survivors who carried stories across the stars of two figures that rose from death to hunt an empire. Some called them phantoms, others called them demons, but those who had seen their eyes knew. They were worse, for they were men made into nightmares. The Baba Yaga had returned to the galaxy not as myth whispered in corners, but as flesh and blood, as shadow and steel, his name now carved into every tale of fear. The American Boogeyman stood beside him, a figure of relentless vengeance, a man who carried war in his veins and silence in his soul. Together they moved like storms, leaving trails of ruin across each world that had raised the banner of the Empire. Patrol ships vanished in void space, never reaching their destinations, their wreckage discovered drifting with no crew aboard. Supply convoys burned on distant moons, their escorts slaughtered without a single distress call reaching command. Entire colonies whispered of figures seen walking through smoke and fire, men who left no survivors and spoke no words. The Empire convened councils of generals and strategists who pored over maps and reports, yet none could explain how two men could unmake armies. Some declared it impossible, and yet the evidence lay in ashes across half a dozen worlds. The more the Empire fought them, the stronger the legends grew, until fear spread faster than orders, and obedience cracked beneath the weight of dread. Soldiers began to desert before battles even began, refusing to face the Baba Yaga or the Boogeyman. Others took their own lives rather than be hunted by shadows that struck without mercy. Commanders pleaded for reinforcements, but even reinforcements dissolved into silence, for no garrison, no fleet, no fortress remained untouched. The Baba Yaga struck from the dark, his precision flawless, his patience endless, his presence more terrifying than the clash of armies. The boogeyman struck with fury, turning every battlefield into a graveyard, every defense into rubble, every boast of the empire into hollow echoes. The empire had believed they killed 2 prisoners, but instead they had opened the gates to nightmares that would not rest until the galaxy was free of their rule. Whispers turned to chants across the oppressed world. Peasants, slaves, and rebels alike took courage in the destruction. They witnessed if 2 men could bring an empire to its knees, then perhaps the galaxy itself could rise and shatter its chains. The Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman did not claim thrones, they did not raise banners, they did not seek crowns, they moved only with purpose, with vengeance, with a silence that screamed louder than any victory song. And so the empire legacy began to crumble, not under the weight of fleets or nations, but under the steps of 2 men who refused to die. In the end, history did not remember the commanders who gave the order of execution. History remembered only the mistake that awakened legends who turned fear into fire and carved their vengeance across the stars.